The morning of the auction, there were 120 goats nobody wanted. They stood crowded in the back pen at the Logan County stockyard, ribs showing through dull coats, hooves overgrown, eyes rimmed with the kind of weariness animals carry when they have been hauled too far in a trailer that smelled like the last animals that died in it. The auctioneer had already worked through the cattle and the good sheep and the 3 nervous llamas that went to a hobby farmer from Beckley, and now he was looking at his clipboard, the way a man looks at a chore he had been hoping somebody else would do. The goats had come from an estate sale up near the Kentucky line, the last holdings of an old man who had run them on rocky ground for 40 years, and died without telling anyone what he intended for them. They were a mongrel herd, no papers, no breed standard, knees knobby, one of them limping, 2 of them so small the men at the rail laughed and said they looked like dogs somebody had shaved wrong. The starting bid was set at $15 a head, and nobody raised a hand. The auctioneer dropped it to 10, then 5. Then he said, almost to himself, that he would take an offer on the whole lot. Somebody come haul them off, and a man in a feed cap at the back of the bleachers shouted that he would give $2 apiece if the seller threw in the trailer for free, and the room laughed because that was the joke of the morning, and everybody needed one. That was when Hollis May Crowder stood up. She was 23 years old, narrow at the shoulders, hair pulled back in a way that suggested she had not thought about it since dawn, wearing her grandfather's old barn coat, which was 2 sizes too large and patched at the elbow, with a square of denim that did not match. She had been sitting in the 3rd row since 7 that morning, drinking gas station coffee out of a paper cup, and she had not bid on a single thing. She walked down to the front, handed the clerk a folded check, and said in a voice that did not need to be loud because the room had gone curious enough to lean toward her, that she would take all 120. The man in the feed cap laughed first, and then stopped laughing when he saw she was not joking. The auctioneer asked her twice if she understood what she was buying. She said she did. He asked her if she had transport. She said her uncle was bringing 2 trailers and would be there inside the hour. He looked at the check, looked at her, looked at the goats, and brought the gavel down with the same flat sound he used for everything. And just like that, 120 animals nobody wanted belonged to a young woman nobody in that room had ever heard of. The man in the feed cap, whose name was Delmar Pickett, and who owned 600 acres of good bottom land 3 ridges over from where Hollis May lived, leaned to the man beside him and said loud enough for her to hear that she had just bought herself $240 worth of coyote bait and a year of regret. He had meant it as a prediction of failure. It would turn out to be a prediction of something else entirely. Before we go any further, do me a small favor. If you like stories about quiet people who see what nobody else sees, tap the like button, and down in the comments tell me what city or town you are watching from. I read them all. Now, let's begin. Hollis May Crowder had come back to Crowder Hollow in March, 2 months before the auction, not because she had a plan, but because her grandmother had called her on a Tuesday evening and said, in the same flat tone she used for weather reports, that the house was hers if she wanted it, and that nobody else was going to live in it. Hollis had been working 2 jobs in Charleston, waiting tables at a diner near the Capitol in the mornings and stocking shelves at a hardware store on the night shift, and she had been tired in a way that sleep no longer fixed. She had packed everything she owned into the bed of a 1994 Ford Ranger that her grandfather had given her when she turned 16, an engine that the mechanic in Charleston had described as composing its own obituary, and she had driven the 83 miles south to the Hollow, where her people had lived since before the Civil War. The house sat at the end of a gravel road that the county did not maintain past the 2nd Cattle Guard. It was a 4-room frame house with a tin roof her grandfather had put on in 1978, a wood stove in the kitchen, a porch that faced east, and behind it 312 acres of land that the county tax assessor had appraised at $190 an acre because most of it was too steep to plough, too rocky to hay, and too dry in summer to graze cattle on without losing weight on every head. Her grandmother, Verley Crowder, was 81 years old and lived in a single-wide trailer down the road on the flat piece her son had given her when her husband died, and she came up to the house the morning Hollis arrived, carrying a tin of biscuits and a quart jar of apple butter and a key that didn't fit any lock Hollis could find. Verley set the food on the kitchen table, looked around the room, and said the house had good bones and bad windows, and that the well still pulled clean if you primed it right. Then she sat down in the rocker by the stove and watched Hollis unpack for an hour without saying anything else. And when Hollis asked her what the key was for, Verley said she did not remember, but that her husband had given it to her before he died, and told her to give it to whichever grandchild came home to stay. Hollis put the key in a coffee can on the windowsill and did not think about it again for a long time. The first weeks were spent on the kind of work that does not show. Hollis cleaned the chimney and patched the worst of the roof and pulled a dead possum out of the crawl space and ran a new line from the well house to the kitchen sink. Because the old one had cracked in a freeze, nobody had been there to notice. She walked the property line, all 312 acres of it, in pieces, a different section each morning, carrying a notebook in the breast pocket of her grandfather's coat and a pencil she sharpened with a pocket knife. She wrote down what she saw. She wrote down the places where the soil was thin over limestone, the places where briars had taken the old pasture, the stand of black walnut on the north slope that her grandfather had planted the year her father was born, the seep on the east side that ran clear in March and disappeared by July. She wrote down the foundation stones of a barn that had burned in 1962 and the rusted hinges of a gate that no longer had a fence to swing from. She did not know yet what she was looking for. She only knew that her grandfather had written things down all his life in ledgers he kept in a wooden box under the bed in the front room, and that if she was going to live on this ground, she ought to learn it the way he had. Slow and on foot and without expectations. Verley came up to the house on Sundays and sat in the rocker, and did not say much, but on the fourth Sunday she asked Hollis what she meant to do with the place, and Hollis said honestly that she did not know yet. And Verley nodded, as if that were the correct answer, and said that her husband had told her once that the land would tell you what it wanted if you stopped telling it what you wanted first. Then she said that the goats were what had kept them through the bad years, back when nothing else would grow on the upper pasture. And Hollis asked what goats, and Verley said the goats they used to run before the boys went off, and there was nobody to fool with them anymore. She said it the way you would mention an old hat you had not worn in 30 years. Hollis wrote it down in the notebook that night. Goats, upper pasture, bad years. She underlined it once, and then crossed it out, and then underlined it again. A week later, she drove down to the feed store in Hinton to ask about hay prices for the summer, and while she was waiting at the counter, she heard two men talking about an estate sale up at the stockyard the following month, 120 head of scrub goats coming off a place near the Kentucky line, and one of the men said nobody was going to bid on them because they were the worst-looking herd he had seen come through in 10 years. Hollis paid for her salt blocks and walked out to the truck and sat there for a long time with her hands on the steering wheel. Then she drove home and went down to her grandmother's trailer and asked Verley if she remembered what kind of goats her grandfather had run. Verley thought about it for a minute and said they had been mostly Spanish, some Kiko mixed in later, nothing fancy, animals that could browse the brush and birth without help, and hold their weight on ground that would starve a cow. Hollis asked her if 120 was too many to start with. Verley looked at her for a long beat without expression, and then she said that the number did not matter as much as whether you had water for them. Hollis said the seep on the east slope ran most of the spring. Verley said the seep was not the water her husband used. Hollis asked her what water he had used. Verley said she did not rightly remember, but that he had kept it written down somewhere, and that there was a key in a coffee can on the windowsill that he had told her to pass along, and Hollis felt the back of her neck go cold and warm at the same time. She drove home and took the key out of the coffee can and held it in her palm and looked at it the way she had looked at the goats 2 weeks later in the stockyard, in silence, for a long time, before she put it back and went to bed without trying any locks. She had a feeling the lock would find her when it was ready, and she was not wrong. The goats arrived at Crowder Hollow on a Wednesday afternoon in late May, hauled in her uncle's 2 stock trailers up the gravel road in 2 trips, and they came down the loading ramps blinking in the sun and stood in a loose huddle on the gravel in front of the barn, as if waiting to be told where the next bad thing was going to happen. Hollis had spent the 4 days between the auction and the delivery building, a temporary corral out of cattle panels she had bought on credit from the feed store in Hinton, and she had cleared the brush from the old upper pasture with a borrowed brush hog and a chainsaw, whose chain she had to sharpen twice an hour because the wood up there had grown back hard and stubborn. She walked among the goats that first afternoon, counting them, touching each one on the shoulder as she passed, looking at hooves and eyes and the curve of ribs, and she made a mark in her notebook for every animal she thought would need extra care in the first month. The mark count came to 41. That left 79 that were merely thin and tired, which by her grandfather's old standards, written in a ledger she had begun reading by lamplight at night, was a workable starting condition. She did not name them. She held that line. She almost held that line. There was one doe, a small Spanish cross with a white face and a black patch over her left eye, who limped on the right hind from an old injury that had healed wrong, and who kept positioning herself between Hollis and the rest of the herd as if she had decided on her own to be the translator, and Hollis caught herself calling that one Patch by the end of the first week and did not correct it. The rest stayed numbered. She wrote the numbers on small plastic ear tags she clipped on herself one evening with a borrowed applicator, working alone in the cooling dusk while the goats complained and then quieted, and by the time she finished the moon was up over the ridge and her hands were stiff and her back hurt in a way she had not felt in Charleston. She walked back to the house and ate a cold biscuit standing at the kitchen counter and went to bed without taking off her boots and slept for 9 hours, which she hadn't done since she was a child. The word got around the hollow within a week. Delmar Pickett drove past in his new Silverado on the second Saturday and slowed at the bottom of her drive and shook his head and drove on without stopping, and the woman at the gas station in Sandstone, where Hollis bought her gas, asked her on the following Tuesday how the goat operation was coming, and the way she said the words goat operation made it clear she was repeating what she had heard other people say. Hollis said it was coming along, thank you for asking, and paid for her gas and left. At the feed store, the men who gathered around the coffee pot in the mornings had taken to calling her place the petting zoo, and one of them, a cattleman named Roy Henley, who ran 400 head of Angus on the bottoms near Hinton, told the others within Hollis's hearing one morning, when she came in for minerals, that the trouble with goats was that they ate everything down to dirt, and then the dirt washed away, and you were left with rocks and regrets. He had not been speaking to her directly, but he had not been hiding either, and Hollis paid for her minerals, and on her way out, said to him pleasantly that that was one approach to thinking about it, and she would let him know how it went. Roy Henley laughed and said he would hold her to that, and the other men laughed with him, and Hollis drove home and did not think about it again until much later. The first month was hard in the small ways that nobody who has not done it understands. She lost 3 goats in the first 10 days, all of them animals she had marked as fragile, 2 to pneumonia they had brought with them in the trailer, and 1 to a twisted gut that nothing she could have done would have prevented. She buried them on the back edge of the upper pasture, in graves she dug herself with a post-hole digger and a long-handled spade, and she wrote their numbers in the notebook with a small dash beside each one, and did not write anything else. The remaining 117 began, slowly, to change. They had been put on browse instead of hay, turned out onto the upper pasture, where the multiflora rose, and the autumn olive and the young sumac had been allowed to take over for 15 years, and within 2 weeks Hollis could see the difference in their coats. The dull grey sheen had begun to turn glossy. The ribs were still there, but the hollows above the hips were filling. Patch had stopped limping as badly because she was no longer standing on concrete in a holding pen, but on soft duff under oak trees. By the end of the first month, when Verley came up on a Sunday and walked the upper pasture with Hollis for the first time, the old woman stopped halfway up the slope and watched the herd browse for a long minute, and then said, without looking at Hollis, that they were the right kind. Hollis asked her what she meant. Verley said her husband used to say that goats raised on browse tasted different from goats raised on grain, and that the people who knew the difference would pay for it, but you had to find them. Then she said, "Those are the ones," and started walking back down to the house, and Hollis stood on the slope for a long time after she had gone, watching the herd move through the brush, before she pulled the notebook out of her pocket and wrote down the words, "taste different," and underlined them twice. By July, the upper pasture had been cleared of brush in patches that radiated out from the barn like the petals of a slow flower, and the herd had moved on to the second pasture, the long sloping piece on the south face that her grandfather had called the dry side because nothing but cedar and locust had ever wanted to grow there. The goats wanted to grow there. They wanted the cedar bark and the locust leaves and the wild grape that had laced the fence rows for decades, and Hollis moved them in a rotation she had worked out by reading the old ledgers and by walking the ground every morning at first light. She had become a person who got up at 4:30 without an alarm. She had become a person who could tell from 50 yards away which of her does were close to coming into season, and which of them were already bred. She had bought a young Kiko buck from a breeder over in Greenbrier County in June for $200 cash, an animal with good feet and a calm temperament, and papers that she had folded into the back of the notebook, because the breeder had insisted she keep them, and she had named him Wendell after a great-uncle she had never met because Verley had laughed when she suggested it. The buck had settled into the herd with the kind of quiet authority that only the right animal carries, and by late July, Hollis was reasonably sure that most of her does would kid in the early winter, which was when her grandfather's ledgers said the prices ran highest because it was off-season, and the demand from the cities on the East Coast did not slow down for weather. She had begun, in the evenings after supper, to read those ledgers in a different way. She was no longer looking at them as a record of what had been. She was looking at them as a set of instructions written by a man who had assumed somebody would eventually need them, and she had begun to feel, in a way she could not have explained to anyone, that he had known it would be her. The ledgers went back to 1958. They were written in a slanted, careful hand in pencil, and they tracked everything, kidding dates and weights and prices and weather and which animals had been culled and why. and in the back of the third ledger, Hollis found a folded sheet of paper with a hand-drawn map of the property on it. The map showed the house, and the barn, and the upper pasture, and the dry side, and in the middle of the dry side there was a small circle with the word spring written next to it in the same careful pencil, and an arrow pointing from the circle to a notation in the margin that read, "Covered over 1971. Do not disturb until needed. Key in coffee can." Hollis read the line 3 times. Then she walked to the windowsill and took the key out of the coffee can and held it in her palm, and she understood for the first time what her grandfather had done. The dry side was not dry. It had been dry since 1971 because he had buried something. She did not go up the slope that night. She sat in the rocker by the stove with the map on her knee and the key in her hand, and she thought about the kind of man who would cap a spring on his own land and write a note about it in a ledger and tell his wife to pass a key to a grandchild who had not been born yet, and she thought about what kind of need he might have been anticipating. She thought about it for 3 days. On the 4th day, she walked up the dry side with the map and a shovel, and Patch trailing along behind her, the way Patch had taken to doing whenever Hollis went anywhere on foot, and she found the spot. It was under a flat slab of sandstone, the size of a kitchen table that had been pulled over from the ridge above and set into the hillside in a way that looked natural unless you knew to look. She did not try to move the slab that day. She marked the corners of it with 4 small cairns of white quartz so she could find it again, and she walked back down the slope and went to her uncle's house in the next hollow over and asked him if he would bring his tractor up the following weekend. He asked her what for. She said she needed to move a rock. He looked at her for a mini ute and said all right, and didn't ask any more questions, which was the way her uncle had always been, and the reason she had asked him instead of anyone else. He came on Saturday morning with the old Ford 4000 he had owned since before Hollis was born, and they hooked a chain to the slab and dragged it sideways down the slope about 10 feet, and underneath there was a circle of stones mortared together with a wooden cover laid over the top, and the wooden cover had a hasp on it, and the hasp had a lock, and the lock fit the key that Hollis had carried in her coat pocket all the way up the hill. Her uncle stood back. He did not ask what was in the well. He had seen her face and decided whatever it was belonged to her. Hollis turned the key and lifted the cover, and the smell that came up was clean and cold and mineral, the smell of water that had been waiting in the dark for 53 years. She knelt and looked down. The shaft was lined with fieldstone laid by hand, and about 6 feet down the surface of the water caught the morning sun and threw it back at her in a small bright disk. She lowered a length of baling twine with a pebble tied to the end and measured the depth. The water stood 11 feet deep in a shaft that was 4 feet across. She did the arithmetic in her head, and then again on paper that evening, and came up with a standing volume of just over 1,000 gallons, and a recharge rate she would not know until she pumped it down and watched it come back, but that her grandfather's ledger, when she found the relevant page 2 nights later, recorded as 4 gallons a minute in the driest August he had ever measured it. 4 gallons a minute, 240 gallons an hour, enough water to run a herd 10 times the size of hers through the worst summer the county had ever seen. She sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open in front of her, and the lamp turned low, and she did not cry, because that was not what she did. But she put her forehead down on the open page for a long minute, and breathed in the smell of old paper and pencil lead, and when she sat back up, she felt the way people feel when they have been handed something they did not know they had been waiting for. Her uncle helped her, over the next 2 weeks, run a black plastic line down the slope from the spring head to a stock tank she set in the corner of the dry side pasture under a sycamore, and they buried the line 2 feet down with a trenching attachment he borrowed from a neighbor, and they set a simple float valve in the tank so that the water would run only when the level dropped. They did not put in a pump. They did not need one. The spring sat 30 vertical feet above the tank, and the water came down on its own, the way water had been coming down hillsides since before there were people to notice. On the day they opened the valve and watched the tank fill for the first time, Patch walked over and drank from it, and then looked up at Hollis with water dripping from her chin, and Hollis laughed out loud, which was something she hadn't done in front of another person in a long time, and her uncle laughed with her, and then they sat on the slope and ate sandwiches Verley had sent up in a paper bag and did not say much else. By October, the herd had grown into themselves. The thin, ribby animals that had come off the trailer in May were unrecognizable. Their coats had filled in, glossy and full. The does were round through the barrel with the kidding that would come in December and January. Wendell the buck walked the dry side pasture like he had built it himself, and Patch had taken to sleeping on the porch some nights, which Hollis allowed because she had stopped pretending she was not going to. Hollis had begun, in September, to think about what came next. The ledgers were clear about what her grandfather had done with the meat. He had sold it locally, mostly to families who came up from the hollows for a half or a quarter at a time, and he had sold the occasional whole animal to a small slaughterhouse over in Alderson that processed for restaurants in Louisburg and White Sulphur. The slaughterhouse was still there. Hollis had driven past it twice. She had not gone in yet, because she wanted to know what she was selling before she tried to sell it, and she wanted to taste it herself, and she wanted Verley to taste it, because Verley was the only person alive who remembered what her grandfather's goats had tasted like in the years when people had paid for the difference. The first animal she took was a yearling wether she had decided in August would not be kept, a good-sized castrated male with clean conformation and the particular glossy coat that came from a summer of browse, and she took him to the small custom processor over in Pocahontas County, who would do a single animal for a flat fee and return the meat cut and wrapped however she asked. She brought the meat home in a cooler on a Tuesday afternoon in early October, and she cooked a shoulder that night in the wood stove the way Verley had told her to, slow and low, and with nothing on it but salt and a little garlic from the garden, and she carried half of it down to Verley's trailer, wrapped in foil. Verley unwrapped the foil at her kitchen table and cut a small piece and chewed it slowly and closed her eyes, and when she opened her eyes again, she looked at Hollis for a long moment, and then she said, "That is exactly what it used to taste like," and Hollis felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't known was tight. Verley said, "You need to take some of that to Junior Hagerman." Hollis asked who Junior Hagerman was. Verley said he ran the kitchen at a hotel in Louisburg, that he was the second son of Verley's cousin Edith, that he had been a thin, sand boy who had grown into a man who cooked food for people who did not know how lucky they were, and that he would know what to do with the rest of the shoulder. Hollis drove to Louisburg on Thursday with the rest of the shoulder packed in a small cooler with a note pinned to the foil that said, "Verley Crowder sent this. Please taste it. My name is Hollis. My number is on the back." She left it at the front desk of the hotel because the kitchen was closed between lunch and dinner, and she drove home and didn't think about it for 2 days. On Saturday morning, Junior Hagerman called her. He said he had eaten the shoulder cold standing at the counter in the kitchen at 10 o'clock on Thursday night after his shift, and that he had then driven home and woken his wife up to tell her about it, and that he wanted to buy 4 whole goats a month for the foreseeable future if she could deliver them, and that he wanted to know what she was feeding them. Hollis said she was feeding them the hillside. Junior was quiet for a second, and then he laughed and said that was the right answer, and they worked out a price on the phone that was 3 times what the stockyard would have paid by the pound, and Hollis hung up and sat on the porch step for a long time, looking at the upper pasture and thinking about the difference between what a thing was worth and what people would pay for it when they finally understood. The first delivery went out the following Wednesday. Junior put the goat on his menu that Friday with the words Crowder Hollow written next to it in small letters, and within 2 weeks, a chef from a restaurant in Charleston had called Hollis on a number she did not recognize and asked if she had any more, and within a month, a woman who ran a butcher shop in Charlottesville had emailed her grandmother's old address because she had not been able to find a current one. And Verley had walked the letter up the hill on a Sunday afternoon with her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. Hollis read the letter at the kitchen table. The woman wanted 20 animals over the course of the winter. Hollis wrote her back that night, in pencil, on a sheet from the notebook. Because she did not have proper stationery, and did not see the need to buy any. And she said yes. And she said it would have to be spread across December, January, and February. And she said the price. And she signed her name. The woman wrote back within a week and agreed to everything. Word moved the way word moves in places where people still talk to each other. By the time the first kids hit the ground in early December, 23 of them in the first week alone, all of them healthy because the does had been on good browse and clean water all summer and fall, Hollis had standing orders from 4 restaurants and 2 butcher shops and a small grocery in Fayetteville that had started carrying her meat in their freezer case with a small printed card next to it that told customers where it had come from and how it had been raised. She was selling everything she could process. She had hired the teenage son of a neighbor, a quiet boy named Levi, who lived 2 hollows over, and who had asked her at the feed store one afternoon if she needed help. And she paid him $15 an hour to come up 3 afternoons a week and help her move fence and trim hooves and do the things that went faster with 2 pairs of hands. Levi did not talk much, which Hollis appreciated, and he watched her work the way she had watched Verley work, which she also appreciated, and within a month he could move the herd between paddocks by himself with nothing but a bucket of minerals and a low whistle she had taught him. The men at the feed store had stopped calling her place the petting zoo. They had not started calling it anything else yet, which was the in-between stage that conventional opinion always passes through before it admits it was wrong. But Roy Henley had taken to nodding at her when she came in for minerals, and the woman at the gas station in Sandstone had asked her one Tuesday in November how she was getting the meat to taste the way people were saying it tasted, and Hollis had said it was the browse and the water, and walked out to the truck without elaborating. Delmar Pickett came up the gravel road on the 2nd Saturday in December in his new Silverado, and he stopped at the bottom of the drive and sat there for a minute with the engine running, and then he drove the rest of the way up and got out and walked over to the corral where Hollis was sorting the does that were closest to kidding into the small barn she had spent November shoring up. He stood at the fence for a while without saying anything. He watched the goats. He watched Patch, who had come over to inspect him, and decided he was acceptable. He cleared his throat. He said he had been at the stockyard the day she bought them. Hollis said she remembered. He said he had said some things at the rail. Hollis said she remembered that too. He looked at his boots for a minute, and then he looked at her, and said he had been wrong, and that he had been telling people for 2 months now that he had been wrong, and that he had a piece of bottomland down off the river that nobody was using because it flooded twice a year and grew nothing but willow and ironweed, and that if she ever needed more ground for her operation, he would lease it to her for $1 a year, because he would rather see something done with it than see it sit. Hollis looked at him for a long moment in the way she had looked at the goats at the stockyard. Then she said she appreciated the offer, and that she would think about it, and that she might come down and walk the piece with him in the spring when the water was high so she could see what she would be dealing with. He nodded. He did not make a large production out of it. He got back in his truck and drove down the gravel road and did not come back for 3 months, which was about the right amount of time, and when he did come back, it was with a load of locust posts he had cut off his own ridge and stacked in the bed of the truck and said she could have for the cost of the gas it had taken to bring them. She thanked him. She did not make a large production out of it either. The first hard loss came in late February. Verley had been slowing through January, sleeping later, eating less, and on a Tuesday morning when Hollis went down to the trailer to bring her a jar of broth from the kitchen, she found her grandmother in the rocker by the propane heater, with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes closed, and the small space heater humming quietly beside her. And she had gone in the night without any fuss, the way she had done everything else in her life. Hollis sat on the floor beside the rocker for a long time. She did not cry yet, because the crying had not arrived. She held Verley's hand, which was cool and very light, and she looked at the room, the small, clean kitchen, the calendar on the wall with the days marked off in pencil, the photograph on the side table of Verley and Hollis's grandfather, standing in front of the barn that had burned in 1962, both of them young and squinting into the sun. And she thought about the conversation they had had in May, about the goats, and about the water, and about the things her husband had written down. She thought about how Verley had walked the letter up the hill in October with her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and how she had eaten the cold shoulder at her kitchen table and closed her eyes, and how she had said, "Those are the ones on the slope that first Sunday in June." She thought about how little Verley had said, across all of it, and how much each thing she had said had turned out to mean. The funeral was on the following Saturday at the small Baptist church down at the crossroads, and most of the Hollow came, including Delmar Pickett and Roy Henley and the woman from the gas station whose name Hollis learned for the first time was Bernice. And Junior Hageman drove up from Lewisburg in a black suit and stood at the back of the church with his hands folded, and afterward, at the grave under a sky the color of pewter, Hollis stood beside her uncle and watched the dirt go in, and felt the cold come up through her boots, and did not cry until she was alone in the truck on the drive home. She cried then for about 10 minutes, with her forehead against the steering wheel in the gravel drive at the bottom of the hill, and then she wiped her face and got out and walked up to the barn, because the does were kidding, and there were 3 of them close that night, and the work did not know that anyone had died. Patch met her at the gate. The first kid that came that night was a small black doeling with a white star on her forehead, and Hollis caught her in a clean towel and rubbed her dry and put her under the heat lamp in the small pen she had built for new mothers, and she sat on an overturned bucket in the dim, warm barn and watched the doe lick the kid clean, and she said out loud, to nobody, that her grandmother had been a good woman, and the doe looked up at her for a second and went back to her work. The 2 other does kidded before dawn. Hollis did not sleep that night, and she did not sleep much the next night either, and by the end of the week she had 31 new kids on the ground, and a numbness behind her eyes that she knew from experience would lift eventually, and did. Verley had left her the trailer and the small piece of flat ground it sat on, and a savings account at the bank in Hinton that turned out to contain a little over $11,000, and a handwritten note in an envelope on the kitchen table that said, "Only," in the same careful pencil hand her husband had used in the ledgers, "tell Hollis the buck she picked was the right one." Hollis read the note 3 times and put it in the back of the 3rd ledger with the hand-drawn map and did not show it to anyone. She did not expand quickly. That was the thing the men at the feed store kept waiting for and kept being surprised by. By the 2nd year, when the herd had grown through kidding to 240 animals, and the orders had grown to the point where she could have sold 3 times what she was producing, Hollis still had not borrowed money, and still had not bought more land, and still had not hired anyone besides Levi, who was now working 5 afternoons a week and on Saturdays, and who had told her in the spring that he wanted to keep working for her after he graduated high school, instead of going to the community college his mother had been pushing him toward. Hollis told him to go to the community college and work for her on weekends and evenings, and to study something useful like accounting or animal science, and that she would pay for the books if his mother would pay for the tuition. And Levi had thought about it for a week and agreed. She did walk Delmar Pickett's bottomland with him in April of the 2nd year, and she did lease it from him for $1 a year as he had offered, and she put 20 of the older does down there over the summer to clean up the willow and the ironweed, and by fall the piece looked different enough that Delmar drove down to look at it, and stood on the bank and shook his head and said he had owned that ground for 30 years, and never thought it could look like that. Hollis said it was the goats. Delmar said he knew it was the goats, and that was what he was shaking his head about. The expansion, when it came the same way everything else had come, by patience and by demand, pulling her forward instead of ambition pushing her. In the 3rd year, she bought the adjoining 60 acres from the estate of a neighbor who had died without heirs, paying cash from money she had saved, and she did not fence it for the first 6 months because she wanted to walk it first and learn it the way she had learned her grandfather's ground. In the 4th year, she built a small on-farm processing room with a USDA-inspected setup, financed out of savings, and a small grant from a state program for beginning farmers, and she hired a woman from over in Greenbrier who had worked at the Alderson slaughterhouse for 20 years and wanted a quieter situation closer to home. By the 5th year, Crowder Hollow goat was on menus in Washington and Richmond and Asheville, and a food writer from a magazine in New York had driven down on a Tuesday in October and walked the dry side with Hollis and stood at the spring head and looked down into the water and asked her how she had known to look for it, and Hollis had said her grandfather had left her a map, and the woman had written that down in a small notebook and not asked any more questions, which Hollis appreciated. The article ran the following spring. It was a long article, and it had photographs, and one of the photographs was of Hollis standing on the slope of the dry side, with Patch beside her, and the herd spread out behind her, browsing through the locust and the wild grape, and the caption under the photograph said only her name and the name of the place. Hollis bought 1 copy of the magazine at the gas station in Sandstone and gave it to Bernice to put on the counter, and Bernice did, and it stayed there for 2 years until somebody finally took it. Roy Henley came up the gravel road one Saturday morning in the 6th year with a thermos of coffee and 2 cups, and he sat with Hollis on the porch step, and they drank the coffee and watched the upper pasture for about an hour without talking much, and when he stood to leave, he said he had been telling his grandson about her operation, and that the boy wanted to come up sometime and see how it worked. And Hollis said to bring him any Saturday, and Roy nodded and went down to his truck and drove off. And that was as close as Roy Henley ever came to saying out loud what he had said at the feed store 6 years earlier, which was close enough. The morning of the